And we came up with the idea that most tokens really are single use for a single context, a single event, whereas coins, of course, circulate again and again.
Welcome to Lesky, a podcast on new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Hanning, and I'm a classicist at Brown University. If you've ever been to a classicist wedding, chances are you've heard one of two ancient passages read at it. Either Odysseus' little speech to Nausicaa in Odyssey 6 about homophorsunae and how it makes for a good marriage, or else a portion of Aristophanes' speech from Plato's Symposium. And the gist of that speech is as follows. In the beginning, humans were spherical beings with 4 arms, 4 legs, and 2 faces. They came in 3 types, all male, all female, and androgynous, or male-female. These original humans were incredibly powerful and arrogant, so they attempted to storm heaven and challenge the gods. As punishment, Zeus split each human in half, creating the humans we know today. Apollo then turned their heads around and pulled their skin tight, creating the navel, the belly button, as a reminder of their former wholeness. So now, each half-human spends their life searching for the other half, what today we might call our soulmate. And Aristophanes explains to his fellow banqueters that, quote, ancient is the desire of one another which is implanted in us, reuniting our original nature, making one of two, and healing the state of man. Each of us is a mere fragment of a human being because we are sliced in two like fillets of a fish, and so each is always looking for his other half. And here what the Greek says is that each one is always looking for their symbolon. So the word symbolon that Aristophanes uses here comes from the verb symbolo, meaning to throw together or to join. A symbolon was literally an object that had been broken or cut in two, and which each party was keeping one half of as proof of their relationship or agreement. And then when the two pieces were brought back together, when they symbolized with each other, they then validated the bond between the two holders. This concept of the symbolon as necessarily incomplete, always seeking its other half, illuminates something crucial about ancient tokens that distinguishes them fundamentally from later coinage. These early tokens were never conceived of as autonomous, self-contained units of value. Instead, like Aristophanes' divided humans, they were understood as fragments that gained meaning and authority only when reunited, in a manner of speaking, with their corresponding piece. If you're like me, you might have taken for granted the appearance of symbola in ancient literature, especially tragedies, comedies, and novels, where they're often important devices of recognition. My guests for this episode, Claire Rowan and Mary Gikaki, will be explaining the fascinating material reality of symbola, that is, of ancient tokens. We know of tokens associated with guest-friend relationships, commercial contracts, international treaties, banking operations, temple operations, and more. The omnipresence and range of their uses in antiquity is astounding, which makes it all the stranger that they're so little discussed outside of numismatist circles. Claire Rowan is an associate professor in the Department of Classics and Ancient History at the University of Warwick. She specializes in ancient numismatics, in particular ancient tokens, iconography, and small change. She was the principal investigator on the European Union Research Council-funded project Token Communities of the Ancient Mediterranean, which ran out of Warwick from 2016 to 2021. M.E., or Mary Gikaki, is an honorary research fellow at the Department of Classics and Ancient History, University of Warwick, where she's also been a Marie Curie Research Fellow and a team member of the ERC-funded project, Token Communities of the Ancient Mediterranean. She's editor of the volume Tokens in Classical Athens and Beyond, which came out with Liverpool in 2023, and her monograph Symbola, Athenian Tokens from Classical to Roman Times, will soon be appearing also with Liverpool University Press. Just a quick note that, as ever, I've put a few references in the show notes for this episode. And yet another reminder that Lesky is on Instagram. The handle is @LeskyPodcast. I have posted a couple of images there to accompany this episode, so be sure to check out that account. Finally, I will be releasing the next regular episode in 2 weeks' time, but then I'll be taking a break for August. Lesky will be back for its second season on September 3rd, and I've already got some great topics and guests lined up. But for now, I'd like to welcome into the Lesky Claire Rowan and Mary Gikaki. The next voice you'll be hearing is Claire's.
I've worked in numismatics, so on ancient coinage, for many, many years. And a couple of years ago, I was putting together a different research proposal, which was unsuccessful, on alternative currencies kind of across time. And I was in the Sackler in Oxford, kind of scrounging around for examples to put in this research proposal. And I came across Rostovtsev's catalogue of tokens, lead tokens from Rome, which he called tesserae. And I opened up the volume and I was just flabbergasted that I had no idea that these things existed, that no one else seemed to be talking about them. And I thought, my God, like why is no one working on these? Why have we forgotten they exist? And from there, the proposal that I put to the ERC was born, where I've discovered, of course, there are not only tokens from the city of Rome that are kind of neglected, but an extraordinary quantity of tokens from across the ancient Mediterranean, actually. And even till today, there's still lots of tokens about that are unstudied and neglected. So yeah, that's how I came about it. And I included Athens as a case study because that was the one area that had seen the most kind of recent work with the publication, okay, and it's not that recent, but in the 20th century at least, of the tokens, the lead tokens that were found during excavations of the Agora. So yeah, so I knew that there was some study there.
And so what exactly was the chronological and geographical scope of the project?
Yeah, so we began with the earliest tokens of Athens, these jigsaw puzzle tokens, which Mary can talk a little bit more about. And then we went up until the 3rd century, where tokens in Rome seemed to kind of fall off. But I was soon corrected on this chronology because we had an application from another researcher, Christian Mondello, who's at Messina now. He pointed out to me there were actually tokens well into late antiquity, with also Christian groups creating them. And so he's been working very much on late antiquity, and they continue really up until, Theodosius. And I think the last token issued out of the city of Rome was by the last consul of Rome before he fled to Constantinople. It was a token issued in connection with his building activity. So it really kind of, and they kind of continue, of course, into the Byzantine and medieval period, but in different forms. But you do have to stop somewhere. So,
well, so what is a token anyway, and how is it different than a coin?
Yeah, so tokens, they can look like coins. So the word is monetiform, but they don't act in the same way as coins. So quite often in antiquity, we find that there is a conscious choice of material and design. So they look a bit like coins, but they're clearly not. So a lot of tokens are made in lead, which coins were made in. So even though they look like coins, clearly this is not a coin. And other materials are, of course, clay. And some were made in bronze, but there the designs are so clearly different from money, for instance, carrying large numerals on them, that they can't be mistaken for coinage. And so essentially what a token is, and it's kind of hard to define because, if you think about the English word, we have so many kind of qualifications: love token, locker token, trolley token, drink token. It's an object, sometimes monetiform, that is used to be exchanged for something to represent something. So it could represent a product, like you are entitled to one drink. It could represent a relationship. It could represent a benefaction. And the project really did kind of deal with, how on earth do we find them and what is their kind of characteristics. And we came up with the idea that most tokens really are single use for a single context, a single event, whereas coins, of course, circulate again and again, often for hundreds of years, and fall into the hands of many people. I mean, the idea of a single use also fits quite well with the idea of using lead because it doesn't really last as well as other materials. Yeah, and that's kind of how we went about it. So in Greek, the word for token is quite clear, actually. It's symbolon or symbola in the plural. In Latin, it's a bit more complicated. They seem to have used a variety of terms, in fact, kind of like our numerous words for token today. So tessera or tesserae, but also nomismata, like a coin-like object, and things like that.
So if in Greek it's symbolon, so this suggests something that you put together with something else. Could you speak a little bit about that aspect of tokens?
Yeah, so the kind of, the Greek is sort of, two halves that are sort of brought together and make kind of a whole. And I think the very earliest tokens in Athens, and also these kind of tesserae hospitales, these tokens of friendship, are kind of two objects that you put together and then you kind of indicate, okay, well, this is valid and it's resembling either the relationship or the need or obligation for hospitality. But the earliest tokens in Athens really do look like puzzle pieces. That's why they're called puzzle tokens. Some are actually on display in the Agora Museum, if you ever happen to be about there, where essentially they're kind of clay pieces that are sawn almost with a jagged cut through the middle that was used for the allocation of offices in early Athenian democracy to try and prevent, manipulation and all those things that the Athenians were always trying to get away with. So to allot the offices, you'd basically have one half of a token and then you'd try and match it to the other half, and matching them together kind of, was the way they sort of did this very early deme allocation. So you can see where the word comes from, although of course these puzzle tokens kind of disappeared quite soon after that, early sort of democracies. So, but the word persists.
Well, speaking of the Athenian democracy and of Athens, Mary, maybe you could say a little bit about what your background was coming into the project, how you got involved in it, and this edited volume that recently came out, which you edited.
Yes. Well, as a numismatist, I was aware of tokens, of Athenian tokens. In Greek, they were called mainly eisiteria, meaning tickets. Eisiteria, the Greek word for tickets. So in the old papers published by Svoronos. While working for the F48 of Antiquities of the Polis of Athens, I came across some new finds. Some new finds coming from the immediate vicinity of the Acropolis. With new finds, I mean finds of the last 20 years, so recent finds. And so it was almost as if a coincidence that it was advertised, the post. Claire advertised the post of a postdoc fellow who would work on Athenian tokens. While working as a fellow in Claire's project, I realized the potential not just for some papers or for an edited volume, but there is a potential even for a big, good monograph discussing tokens and their roles in the Athenian society, how tokens forged the bonds between people, how tokens defined the roles of the citizen in the Athenian society, their role as assembly goer, their role as a sworn juror in the court. So then after the 3-year fellowship or 2-year fellowship, I cannot really remember anymore. Perhaps it was a 2-year fellowship in the ERC project token communities in the ancient Mediterranean. I had the Marie Curie fellowship on TOCATHE. TOCATHE, the acronym is Tokens of Athens. And the edited volume arises from the 1-day workshop we organized. The entire team actually working on tokens.
And the edited volume is mostly dedicated to classical Athens and to its legacy, to its influence.
2/3 of it is entirely dedicated to classical Athens, and 1/3 of it, 1/3 of the edited volume has some case studies from other parts of the Mediterranean, from Sicily, from Judea, and from Ephesus.
So what is it about classical Athens that makes it such a unique case study, or even something more than a case study in this field?
I will give you the default response given by Margaret Crosby 60 years ago. She wrote that Athens is the city, the earliest case of issuing and using tokens with an intensity not attested, not known from any other ancient city prior to Athens. And perhaps Athens acted as a model also for other classical Greek cities, even for Rome, for the Roman tesserae, probably. Well, I think also that we must also think in other terms, that Athens is the ancient Greek city of which we know the most, because so many inscriptions, so many literary texts survive, and also a well-excavated case. So perhaps there is a bias in the case of Athens, and more tokens in other Greek cities remain to be discovered.
When exactly are they introduced, or maybe when does this intensity begin in the case of Athens?
Well, Claire discussed these early jigsaw pieces of the mid-5th century. Then, by the end of the 5th century BCE, tokens, as paid tokens, are used in the courts and in the assembly, and the lead pieces arise perhaps a little bit earlier than the middle of the 4th century BCE, and they are used, the lead tokens, for a variety of purposes. So the intense period begins with the 4th century BCE and continues throughout the Hellenistic period for grain distributions, for festivals, to be exchanged for public pay. Sulla's destruction of the city actually inflicts a violent, but this is a temporary stop to the whole story of tokens. But tokens probably are renewed, the interest in tokens. The Athenians renew their interest in tokens around, I would say, the time of Augustus. And they continue until the Herulaean destruction. After the Herulaean destruction, the whole city has radically changed, and also the institutions of the city have radically changed. The shock of the Herulaean destruction is so strong, and the city will never fully recover, and much of the ancient splendor is forgotten. Perhaps the rich family are not interested in so many benefactions after the Herulaean destruction, I don't know. But in this strata of the Herulaean destruction, we find the most beautiful, like a swan's song. The most beautiful tokens are like a swan's song, as are in the strata of the Herulaean destruction.
Oh, most beautiful in what sense? Can you say a little bit more about them?
They are beautiful because they have so many countermarks.
The typical criterion of beauty.
Beautiful by numismatic standards.
Multiple countermarks. They quote the beautiful cities, landmarks of the classical period, like the Alcamene statue of Dionysus. This is on the tokens. Beautiful because they have, some of them have a legend recording that the Gerousia, the elders of the city, were issuing tokens. The elders of the city were presiding over the festivals, the sacred Gerousia of the city. So these tokens are really very eloquent with an imagery and with multiple stamps, and they enable us to reconstruct the procedures of the festivals in late Roman Athens.
Claire had begun speaking about this, and also, Claire, please feel free to jump in at any point. Mary, could you, if we go back earlier in time, could you speak a little bit about how tokens were used by the democracy? Claire mentioned, and perhaps one of you mentioned the use in the jury context, for example, also in the assemblies, and Claire mentioned the early jigsaw tokens. So how were tokens linked to the evolution of Athenian democracy?
I think it is out of a necessity that the Athenians resort to token as a medium to protect their democracy. Tokens arose in a time of deep crisis. In the final stages of the Peloponnesian War, there are news that in the jurors' courts there were cases of bribery. We hear that in the assembly, while discussing the sending off the Sicilian expenditure with the three generals, Alcibiades and the other two were being sent, that conspirators, like-minded conspirators, were sitting together and were manipulating the procedure in the assembly. And then Philochorus gives us Philochorus, a 4th century BCE Atthidographer, meaning ancient Greek historian, an ancient Greek historian of the 4th century BCE, gives us a precious piece of information, saying that it was in the year 411 BCE that in the council the Athenians began first sitting by letter. The obvious reason in that year is that with the re-establishment of the democracy, with the return to democracy after the dictatorship, the short dictatorship of the 411, the Athenians did their best to thwart every possible new attempt to overturn the democracy. So it seems that it is the antagonism between oligarchs and democrats on the two basic camps in the Athenian Greek state, in the Athenian city-state, these two camps. On one hand we have the oligarchs, on the other hand we have the democrats. Out of this antagonism, tokens arise as a means to safeguard a politics of virtue.
And I mean, the sitting by letter, I think what's amazing in the volume and that came out of the project more generally is that scholars were able, Mary and others were able to actually identify the very tokens that were used to sort of assign seating in the assembly. These are clay tokens. A whole collection of them were found on the Pnyx, which is very nice. And they have letters on them. Some, so an alpha, for instance, written with one single line, then an alpha kind of written with double lines. And they also used the sampi. And so it's clear that these letters correspond to how, the division of the assembly and, to stop people sitting together, to stop conspirators, as Mary was saying. And then we have, of course, Aristophanes in the Assemblywomen talks about, the Assemblywomen are saying, we have to go, get our token. And so it immediately kind of enters the consciousness in that sense. And having these clay tokens as well means if you give out all the tokens, the assembly is quorate. Rather than having someone run around trying to count every individual. Once all the tokens are gone, you're ready to go as an assembly.
So the idea then is that the citizens who showed up to sit in the assembly on a given day were randomly assigned a letter. And they were given a token then with that letter on it. And then that's the section of the assembly that they would have to sit in. And with hopefully, from the democracy's perspective, they weren't sitting next to their friends or co-conspirators or co-plotters or, people that they were likely to stand up and jeer at the orator with. So this is kind of how they worked it. And this is the case both in the assembly and in juries and in courtrooms, or?
Exactly. In both.
And I think, Aristotle talks a lot about, juries. He talked a lot about them, actually. And I think also in the juries, it was, my impression of reading Aristotle, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mary, was that it was to ensure they attended the whole session. Like, you can't turn up late, just turn up to vote having heard nothing, right?
Yeah.
So you got assigned to a particular court, and then you got a token at the beginning of the session, and you had to be there at the end to hand the token in to get paid. So it was a way really to ensure that people did what they were meant to do and took it seriously, because otherwise you wouldn't get paid in this,
Right.
First, to cast their vote. The first thing is so the tokens were distributed to the jurors. So we must imagine that each juror had a token in the hand. while in the courtroom. And then at the end of the day, after the discussion, after both sides were heard, then he cast his vote. Every juror, every one of them, each one of them, and by casting his vote, he gave up also the token. So the token helped him ensured that this was the juror entitled for vote. This was the juror. I mean, first it's to identify the role, to identify the jurors, the panels, that no one unauthorized had entered the courtroom, and then, of course, each juror was eager to get paid. Although that's also a funny detail that in the 4th century, juror pay amounted to just half a drachma, while at the same time, in the assembly pay amounted 1 drachma and a half, because the Athenians were a little bit lazy when it came to the assembly. They were not so fond of assembly meetings. So
maybe they were more boring.
But it was a little bit of boring. So
who enjoys meetings, really?
Yeah. So a little pay was enough for a juror to attend. He did not do it for the pay, but for the sake of fun.
Well, in the case of the jury, it's so interesting that, as you were going through the process, the way that the purpose of the token is continually transforming throughout the day. That first it's telling you where you have to sit, and then it's the vote that you're casting, and then it's sort of the proof that you were there to get your pay. So it's serving multiple functions as the procedure goes along.
This is so amazing that the ancients economize with the same medium. They cover so many aims, so many different needs and aspects. And this is a genuine piece of technology. Democracy had its own technology. And among the various mechanisms of the democracy, the cleroteria, the allotment machines, and now we have also next to these machines also the tokens. The bronze allotment plates is also a piece of democratic technology. Now, next to this mechanism, we have also the tokens as tangible remains of democracy.
Yeah, Mary, I've heard you mention before in another context how interesting this materiality of the Athenian democracy is, how much there seems to be in that kind of under that rubric.
Yes, the materiality and at the same time ideology, because the materiality fills the ideology, and the ideology is again reflected on the imagery of tokens, for example, or of how the token is handled. You know, Johanna, how rare tokens are, because they were handled extremely carefully. So now, in the excavation context, to find a token is really a precious find. And in my forthcoming monograph, I try to calculate the survival rate of tokens. And this is extremely low, because no token should reach unauthorized hands.
And once they had served their purpose, right, if they're made of lead, or they're probably melted down and used for something else, right?
Or they were kept carefully in the drawers. For example, we hear about the conveners of the people. There is an inscription. This is a decree honoring the Sylogaes of the Demos, meaning the conveners of the people of the tribe of Aegeis, the tribe Aegeis. And these magistrates distribute the tokens to the assembly participants at a given morning. They are praised for that purpose, and then they collect all of these back, and they are carefully kept, as I have plausibly, I think, conjectured, in the city's archive.
So the city itself would hold on to the tokens. Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah.
They are not always melted down. The bronze tokens of the jurors, or the clay tokens of the assembly goers could be used over and over again. And they must have been kept in the city's archive, because this big, we have a big lot of 80 pieces discovered in the 1930s. This lot of clay lettered tokens they are very consistent in terms of the letters that are represented. We have alpha, betas, and gammas. In my opinion, meaning that this is a part of archived material. They are not random letters, but are some specific lettered sections represented in the hoard, because they were kept in an archive, in the city's archive, obviously, because all tokens bear the city's seal, the state seal. They are precious items.
Yeah, I mean, the jurors tokens, we've got to mention they are made out of bronze. It's interesting because at this point, Athens, of course, doesn't strike bronze coinage. They were a bit odd about bronze coinage. They resisted it at all costs. So it was clearly then still very different from what an Athenian coin at that time would have looked like, which would have been of silver. And the lead ones seem to be a slightly later development, correct me if I'm wrong, Mary, which are more connected perhaps in the Hellenistic period with the ergotism and things like that. And then, I mean, the last tokens of Athens, these lead ones, there was a large collection of them found in the store of Attulos, and the interpretation by Crosby and the excavators was that this was a collection ready to be melted down, to be reused for another context.
Well, I definitely want to talk more about the materiality of them and get back to the iconography. But first, let me ask Claire, just because you had started to get at this a little bit earlier, could you just explain what these jigsaw tokens are and how they work? And, please, both Claire and Mary.
Maybe Mary has a deeper knowledge of it than I do.
What are these jigsaw tokens and how do they work?
They are small clay pieces, so small that can easily fit the palm of our hand, only a few millimeters thick. They are Symbola. What is a Symbolon? Symbolon are two pieces that can fit together, that they belong together. They were cut before being fired along an irregular jigsaw line, meaning that each piece could only fit its other half. For the purpose and for the interpretation of these pieces, we are lucky enough to have a passage from Aristotle's Athenaion Politeia, which was discussed in the journal Historia of the year 1959 by Mabel Lang. Mabel Lang is the first to discuss it. Because the deans were selling the offices, so the state thought that its magistracy should be decided from the whole citizen body, from the whole of the 10 tribes. The clay letter tokens are painted with the names of the deans. They were obviously scattered and were mixed randomly on a table, and when fitted back again together, they revealed which of the dean would occupy the offices. What was the purpose? It was to safeguard democracy, so as to prevent the smaller and poorer deans from selling the offices to the larger and richer deans. This makes sense with the various magistracies in Athens that were empaneled by 10 persons. For example, the 10 Politeia, the auctioneers of the public property. They were 10, one of each tribe. But each tribe has so many different deans in its territory. A dean, to explain it briefly, is not just a territorial entity, it's also a population entity in ancient Athens. The deans had to compete, and this is again a mechanism for safeguarding politics of virtue. All the deans should have an equal say.
Claire, could you tell us a little bit about some of the more private contexts in which tokens were used? I know it's not always completely possible to wholly distinguish public from private, but apart the classical Athenian democracy aside, what were some other contexts in which people might have used or exchanged tokens?
Yeah, so in Athens, I think Mary's got a very good paper actually in our other volume, Tokens, Culture, Connections, Communities, which, like this volume, actually is freely available, open access online, thanks to the ERC. And in that, and in other contexts, there does seem to be, we think probably euergetic purposes sponsored by elite Athenian families of the Roman period, because as Mary points out, the imagery used on these pieces, some of it echoes coin imagery, which is quite interesting actually, because there's always the eternal question numismatists get, who the hell looked at coinage? And tokens show people actually really did look at it, so much so that they would imitate it. But a lot of the other designs really do kind of match with this broader phenomenon of the elite of Roman Athens, kind of harking back to the glories of the classical past, and you know, the sort of long lineages in that regard. So I think Mary already pointed out that the last kind of tokens that we have from Athens are characterized by a series of countermarks, actually, which is quite rare on tokens. And Athens does seem to be quite unique in the fact that it does countermark a lot of its tokens. And so the discussion is this to show that the token has been used for a particular event, or has it been, or is it to be reused in another event? So just from that, Mary mentioned earlier that there is the suggestion that Rome was also influenced by Athens in creating tokens. And Rostovtsev, who was the first really to work systematically, I think, on the tokens from Rome, that was his theory. He kind of looked at all the tokens of Rome and said, I bet you Augustus got the idea from Athens when he was there. And they do really get going in the imperial period in Rome. And interestingly, Rostovtsev said, in his Habilitationschrift, which was on Roman tokens, he begins by cursing the material, actually. Like, why did I choose this topic? And then saying, actually, I don't think you can do anything with Roman tokens until the Athenian tokens are examined. So it's quite interesting looking at that connection, because I think that's probably true. There is some sort of connection.
I mean, it's striking that something that was born out of the needs of the Athenian democracy, even crisis points in the Athenian democracy, then just became so useful in so many other contexts. But I was wondering, Claire, could you maybe also speak a little bit about instances in which tokens were used as proof of the bearer's or the holder's identity?
Oh yes, this is again kind of earlier, back to the classical period. There are things that Jack Kroll called military tokens, which these are made out of clay, and they have sort of names on them, commanders' names. Again, on display in the Agora Museum. Spend some time next time you're in Athens looking at the tokens on display. You'll be surprised at how small they are. And the idea of these tokens is essentially, like in antiquity, without telephones, without the internet, like how on earth do you send messages, and how do you prove that the messenger is official? So once again, returning to the idea that Mary was talking about, how do you stop imposters, which the Athenians seemed very obsessed with. So the idea is that you would have a token issued to you with, basically whatever authority you're acting under. And so when you turn up to some city to request the army or whatever you're going to request, this token kind of acts as a guarantee that you are, in fact, acting on behalf of an official and not just sort of running around trying to gather an army on the fly privately. So these have been found as well, which are quite interesting in that sense as well, in terms of a proof of identity. But again, really to try and prevent fraud.
Mary, maybe you could speak a little bit more about the iconography of the tokens. What do we see on them, and how does it compare to what we find on coinage?
The iconography derives from the imagery, the repertory of minor arts. So, but not only that, it is quite interesting. For example, the Juros tokens are actually monotone. Monotone because it's only the Athena head. Most of the surviving series today, because we have quite a few different series of Juros tokens that survive to us today, most of them have the head of Athena, designed on purpose to look different than the Athena head on coins. Next to those, I would place an emphasis on state iconography in general. So we have some different signs of Eleusinian iconography, different designs of Eleusinian iconography. For example, Bacchus, this the mystic, or else called the mystic staff, the staff carried by the mystics. We have also Plemohoi or Kernoi, the particular vessels of the Eleusinian cult. Then there is divine iconography. Gods are also present on Athenian tokens. Then, to the other end, I would place some designs that seem on purpose to be illegible. I mean that tokens constitute a code. So they have designs that are made on purpose to resemble something, but not quite easy to say what it is. It may be an animal, it may be a bird. It's always a clear image of something that acts like a code. So it's the approximate 1,000 pieces lead tokens that survive today. They are really very, very interesting in terms of iconography. Some of them, for me, were really posed really a riddle to find out what they depicted on them, because they are either particular Athenian iconography or things that are really very rarely found on vases. For example, we have the triple herm. The triple herm, also called Dionysus herm, with the face, the mask of Dionysus. On the back it is the mask of Ariadne, and on the top of them it's a lion mask. This is the triple herm, which is rarely found on Athenian vase painting. It's extremely rich and engaging, the discussion of the iconography, and as scholars we try to find a pattern which is not readily available, I would say. Some of them seem to have a system that they derive from the myths of the tribes. For example, the myths that are behind the constitution of the tribes. One knows, one will never know, actually.
Well, Claire, I know that you have expertise, particularly in the case of Ephesus. So what was going on with tokens in Ephesus, and if it's worth comparing to the Athenian case, or maybe it's just its own thing?
No, I think it is worth comparing to the Athenian case. So, I mean, it's still ongoing work, because I think, as Mary will agree, I think tokens are a lifetime pursuit to try and come to the bottom of it. But the tokens of Ephesus seem to be quite later than those of Athens and even of Rome. So they seem to really get going in the 2nd century AD, and this is from archaeological contexts, but also the names of the people put on them, and the coins that they imitate are dating from the 2nd and 3rd century, where they are referencing those coins. But as Mary was saying, some of these reference the bulle and the Grusia, again the sacred Grusia, who again are kind of acting in this, I guess, as sponsors of festivals and things like that. But they also carry names on them, and where we've been able to kind of find parallels for these names, it may not be the exact same person, but they're clearly elite families, which in the Roman period in Athens was also, the type of people who were making tokens. So, for instance, there's an Aristion who makes a token with a lion on it, and which Aristion we don't know, but it's nice that, and a Claudius Attalus makes a token which actually shows a bear playing the double flute. So there is also differences. So there is, I think, a sense of fun on Ephesian tokens that I don't know if that is necessarily found on the Athenian ones, which seem more sacred and religious and a bit more serious. There is fun on these Ephesian tokens, but as Mary says, the inspiration for these designs does seem to be where they're not kind of echoing cultic imagery, but minor art. So gemstones, for instance, is probably a good parallel. And I think, like the tokens of Athens in the Roman period, these Ephesian tokens are again likely connected to, acts of euergetism by the elites who were in the city. And so it's quite interesting to think about the designs that they were choosing when they were making these tokens. And I think the variety of imagery, as Mary says, is a bit bewildering, but I think this also connects to the role of tokens, and that if you're holding a banquet, even as a, as the Grusia, you can't issue a token that's the exact same token as last year, because this, again, may attract fraud. Someone may have a token from last year that they turn up with.
And people will judge you just for using last year's token.
Yeah, like we can't come up with a different design. What's interesting too is what's absent, which I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mary, that on the Ephesian tokens, there's just very little reference to the emperor, which disappointed me because I like studying imperial imagery. So in a sense, then, when they're putting these events together, the emperor is clearly not relevant, which is an interesting insight. I delivered a paper talking about Ephesian tokens recently, and the audience were like, "What do you mean? There's very little presence of the emperor. What can this possibly mean?" And the conclusion from the discussion was, the emperor and the imperial family is not important in every context in the Roman world.
Yes, indeed. It is as if the Ephesians are saying, look at us, we are more important. We deserve the admiration, even of the Roman elite. We deserve the admiration because we're Ephesians. And so the most usual design on Ephesian tokens, it is the cult image of Artemis Ephesia, the venerable cult statue of the archaic times. So it's the memory of the city's glorious past. Ephesus can afford this, and at the same time, I would like to add, in connection to your, in continuation to your thoughts, is that the emperor is not present, but the Ephesian elite is very present on the Ephesian tokens. So many names of the Ephesian elite are found on tokens because they were obviously the sponsors of the games, the sponsors of the benefactions, of grain distributions, of festivals.
Yeah, and in the volume that we're discussing, there is a chapter on Ephesian tokens from the museum in Ephesus, actually, which is wonderful to have the material finally being made available.
So who is producing these? Is the production? Are there mints? Do you have dyes, or is it? Claire, you mentioned a comparison with gemstone carving. How are these things being produced?
In the city of Rome and in Ostia, we find the molds, so they were cast there. But that was clearly not the approach for every place that made tokens. And what's kind of fascinating about tokens, actually, is that so not every city makes them. Why some do, some don't, we can discuss. But the cities that do make tokens, each city goes down a different path. So some go with clay, like I think of the so-called tesserae of Palmyra, the banqueting tesserae. They're in all sorts of wild shapes and, largely of clay. In Egypt, they're of kind of lead, but are clearly struck. We don't have any dyes, but I think that's not surprising because we don't really have any dyes for coinage either. You would destroy them after use. And, what's fascinating about the tesserae from Palmyra is that there are a series where you would make kind of these clay tokens for banquets, and then the sponsoring priest of the banquet would impress his seal ring into it. So it's like double stamped in a sense. In Ephesus, they're clearly struck also with a stamp or a die. But what's fascinating about the tokens of Ephesus is, so some of them just are one-sided. Actually, quite a lot of them are one-sided. But you find the same stamp or die then used on another issue that might be double-sided. So it's quite odd, and it's still kind of a puzzle how they all fit together. But in Athens too, they were struck, weren't they, Mary? Was my understanding from
the Athenian tokens, both of the classical and Hellenistic periods, as well as of the Roman imperial period, the Athenian tokens are always struck. They share the same technique as the coins. They're always struck. As concerns the issuers are, for the classical period, it's of course the city itself, meaning at all probability that the council is the main issuer of tokens, that the Athenian council. How do I reach this conclusion? It is because we have the Klinias decree, stipulating that the Council will issue tokens for our allies, and these sealing tokens will provide evidence that this is the correct amount of tribute delivered by our allies. Then the seals will be broken, the sum will be read aloud before the council. Then again, there is another decree, early 4th century BCE, decree honoring Strato, the king of the Sidonians, and there it says again that the council will exchange tokens of friendship, because we have forgotten to talk about this aspect, or a little bit. It was mentioned earlier, I think. Tokens of friendship, tokens of alliance with the king of Sidon. So the council is issuing tokens. Of course, individuals in some official capacity are issuing tokens. For example, we have a token of the year around 100 BCE, and this bears the name of Nikagoras on one side, Polyklitos on the other side. The designs are on one side the tripod, on the other side the cicada. And the persons are known in the prosopography of ancient Athens as sponsors of games. As sponsors of games, they are father and son. And in the Roman imperial period, in Roman Athens, the sacred Gerousia is one of the main issues of tokens, and this is a feature commonly shared with Roman Ephesus. In Ephesus, one of the issues of tokens is the sacred Gerousia, as in the official capacity of organizing, of putting together the festivals of the city, and of safeguarding the purity of the festivals, that the festivals should be genuine and authentic. At the same time, the persons of the elite. In Roman Ephesus, the elite is blatantly stated with their names and titles. We have text on the tokens, on the tesserae of Roman Ephesus, while on the Athenian tesserae, it is with their ancestors. The Athenian elite style themselves, for example, as we are descendants from Alexander the Great. So stand with Alexander the Great. So we're descendants of the same family as the Claudi of the Meliti, and the Claudi of the Meliti are descendants of Pericles. Stand with Pericles. Stand with Miltiades on the tokens, advertising their prestigious family tree, their prestigious identity.
I mean, it's just incredible how many different ways they could be used in, by how many different subsections of different communities. And I think that this work is so exciting. I mean, for me, it was so exciting just because I come more from the literary side of things, and just having kind of read through and somewhat ignored all these references to tokens and tragedy and then comedy, and especially new comedy, and then in the novel where they're also key to recognition. But without having thought of any kind of materiality behind it, just maybe taking for granted the more semantically diffuse sense of tokens as we use it today, and not thinking about this huge proliferation of all these circulating objects. Well, the podcast always ends with a little word association game. Oh. So I hope that you're both willing to play. I don't think it will be too painful. Okay. So with the two of you, I'll call on someone, and just tell me what comes to mind first. Okay. So Mary, I'll start with you and say Symbolon.
It's a Herodotus tale on Glaucus, the Spartan and the Milesian, and how the children of the Milesian came back and they demanded the money. So I'm always I remember more of a text than of an artifact.
How about you, Claire? What comes to mind if I say Symbolon?
Boringly, Aristotle. I've read too much of him.
That's fine. That's great. Okay, well, Claire, I'll keep with you. So what about the jigsaw tokens?
What comes to mind is the color, the orange color of them, in fact. Yeah.
How about you, Mary? If I say jigsaw token, what do you think of first?
I'm especially attracted by the way they write Xipeteon. Xipeteon is written with kappa and sigma, because it is before the Euclidean script was introduced, before the Euclidean script. So I like the script on one of the 4 surviving pieces.
That's great. Well, Mary, here, this one's just for you. I'll say classical Athenian democracy.
The courts, and that the courts are more powerful than the assembly.
And Claire, this is for you, tesserae.
What comes to mind, let's say the mosaic tesserae, and my curses, that every time I would go to a museum database, I had to wade through much mosaic tesserae to find the actual lead tesserae I was after.
There's some like needle in a haystack joke there, yeah.
I advocate that we don't use the word tesserae, just in today's internet world, that we should avoid using the word tesserae for tokens in search databases.
And finally, Mary, I'll ask you, what comes to mind if I say token?
Claire. I only
Claire,
Claire.
That's a great answer. That's a great answer. How about you, for you, Claire?
What comes to mind actually is the Asda or Tesco tokens. I quite often use them when I'm explaining tokens to school groups and stuff like that, because it's something they've seen in daily life. So for those of you who may be listening overseas and want to know if I'm talking about...
Don't regularly shop at Asda or Tesco?
Yeah, in British supermarkets, since they introduced a charge for plastic bags, if you do turn up, in fact, and need to purchase a plastic bag, they give you a token. It's a little plastic thing that says Tesco on it, or whatever the name of the supermarket is. And then you kind of wander out, and there's little voting booths. And you can vote where your 5 cents or whatever you spent, what charity it gets donated to. So you vote, and you can see your little plastic tokens in their little clear plastic containers. And it's an everyday act where you're essentially voting using this object. So there's some really nice parallels actually with antiquity.
That's great. Well, thank you both so much for this. I mean, the project, I think, I learned of it late with actually reading a review of Mary's volume. I'm so happy that I did. This is just like a whole world that I really had no idea about. And it's totally thrilling. Thank you both so much for coming on the podcast and sharing this.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. We thank you. We enjoyed very much the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesky Podcast. And special thanks for their support of the podcast to the Brown University Department of Classics and the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And we'd be grateful if you take a moment to rate the podcast and leave a review. It will help other listeners to find us. We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesky.